I always thought that my life with Sarah was ordinary. We got married 5 years ago, after 2 years of dating in college. Sarah was the kind of person who always smiled, even when her day was terrible. Her kindness, humor, and slightly odd taste in music drew me to her. Our marriage was drama-free. No big scandals, no suspicions. We had a small house in the suburbs of Chicago, a cat named Oliver, and a habit of drinking coffee together every morning. I worked in the financial sector, and Sarah was a children's book illustrator. Her studio was on the top floor of our house. She always said that she needed the space to be inspired. Sometimes I could go upstairs and see her with a brush in her hand, engrossed in her world. We were happy. At least that's how it seemed to me. The first alarm bells went off when she started staying late at night with project friends. She said it was important for work, that they were working on something big, and she couldn't let the team down. I trusted her. Why not? She never gave me any reason to doubt her. But then small things started happening. She would get a message and quickly turn off her phone. She would hide in another room to make calls. Her studio became a closed area, as if there was some kind of secret hiding there. However, I didn't want to be that paranoid person who questioned her every move. Maybe I was being stupid. Maybe I just didn't want to see the truth. One morning, when she left her laptop on the table, I saw an email from someone called Christopher. The message was short, but there was something in it that alarmed me. I'm waiting for you tomorrow. Room 312 as usual. Can't wait. My mind went blank. I didn't know who Christopher was or what the hell was going on, but I felt like I couldn't ignore it. That evening I decided to check on her. I told her I had to work late and I followed her. She met with some man in a hotel in the city center. I saw them go inside together. They didn't even hide it. I stood in front of the entrance and thought about whether to follow them or just go back home. But instead of doing anything, I stayed there, numb, until they left. That night I could not sleep. My head was full of questions. How long had this been going on? Why was I a bad husband? Had she stopped loving me? The next morning, when Sarah acted as if nothing had happened, it made me even angrier. How could she do this? I decided to talk to her, but she beat me to it. We need to have a serious talk, she said over breakfast. Her voice was strangely cold, and I realized that she already knew that I knew everything. What's going on, Sarah? Who is Christopher? She looked at me, and I saw something new in her eyes. It was not fear or guilt. It was tiredness. I can't hide it anymore, Nick. Christopher is not just my friend. He's my lover. But there's something you don't know. Sarah began to tell a story that made things even more complicated. It turns out that Christopher was not just her romantic partner. He was the person who financed her career. He invested in her work, organized exhibitions, and contacted publishers. She said that she started it as a business contact, but it quickly went beyond that. She even said that she wanted to stop everything, but Christopher started threatening her. She said he had compromising information that he could use to destroy her reputation. She was afraid that if she stopped, he would destroy her. But you didn't tell me anything. I could have helped, I shouted, losing control. I was afraid, Nick. I was afraid you would leave me. Her tears seemed sincere, but I didn't know what to believe anymore. My trust was shattered into 1,000 pieces. That night I could not sleep. Her words, full of despair and confusion, kept replaying in my head. I felt anger, frustration, and fear at the same time. What to do now? How to live with this knowledge? But deep down, there was another thought that kept me on my feet. I couldn't just give up. I had to find out more. Not about Sarah. About him. The next day, while Sarah was in her studio, I started looking for information about Christopher. I had his name and surname, I had seen his face, and that was enough to get me started. After a few hours of searching the web, I realized that this man was not who he seemed. He was a well-known art dealer, but he had a long trail of scandals behind him. Suspicions of financial fraud, blackmail, and even the disappearance of people who had worked with him. I was filled with cold fear. How could Sarah have gotten involved with such a dangerous man? Did she know it? Or was she just another victim of his manipulations? That evening I decided to talk to her. But before I could say anything, she came up to me, her face calm, almost distant. "Nick, I've decided. I'm not going to see Christopher anymore. Tomorrow I'll tell him it's over." I felt my heart clench in my chest. I couldn't believe it was that simple. "Are you sure he'll accept it?" I asked, trying to contain my anger. "I am sure. I have no choice. If it ruins my career, so be it. I can't live with this anymore." The next day, she went to meet him. I sat at home, nervously clutching the phone in my hands, ready to pick up the phone at any moment and call the police if something went wrong. But she came home safe and sound. Her face was exhausted, but she looked relieved. "He accepted it," she said. "I thought he would start threatening, but he just said he was disappointed. That was it." It seemed suspicious. The person who had been holding it for months just let it go. The week passed quietly. Sarah went back to work, and I tried to focus on my life. But one day, when I came home, I saw an envelope on our porch. Inside was a paper with an inscription. "Do you think this is over? This is just the beginning." My heart was pounding like crazy. I showed it to Sarah, and she turned white. "It's him," she whispered. "He's not going to stop." I had to do something. I couldn't stand by any longer. That night, I called my friend Jack, who was a private investigator. I told him everything, and he agreed to help. Jack started an investigation, and within a few days we had new facts. Christopher had not only a dark past, but also connections with people who were willing to do his bidding at any cost. Jack warned me to be careful and not to make any sudden moves, but I couldn't just sit and wait. I decided to meet with Christopher myself. It was a stupid idea, but I felt that if I didn't, the situation would only get worse. We agreed to meet in a cafe in the city center. When I saw him, he looked confident and calm. His smile was poisonous. "What do you want, Nick?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "I want you to leave us alone," I said. "And why should I do it?" I had no answer. His confidence made me angry. But then he said something that made me stop. "Sarah didn't tell you everything, did she?" My blood froze. "What do you mean? Do you think I'm just her lover?" "Oh no, Nick. I'm her partner. In every sense of the word. What she's hiding from you is not just our relationship. It's something she's dragged you into without even telling you." His words sounded like a blow. What did he mean by that? I came home full of suspicion. Sarah was sitting in the kitchen. Her face was exhausted. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Sarah, what's going on? What are you hiding from me?" She tried to object, but eventually broke down. "I got us into his scheme," she said, sobbing. "He was using me to launder money. I didn't know it at first, but by the time I realized, it was too late. I signed the documents. I didn't know what to do. My world came crashing down. It was not just a betrayal. It was a catastrophe. Sarah had put us both in danger. I realized now that it wasn't just a matter of betrayal. It was a matter of survival. That night I sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the blank wall. Her confessions replayed in my head like a broken cassette tape. The money laundering, the signed documents, Christopher pulling us into his web. How could I not have noticed this before? How could I have allowed myself to be so naive? I spent the next day looking for a solution. Sarah tried to avoid talking, but her anxiety spoke louder than any words. I knew we both needed to act fast, or we could lose everything: our home, our safety, maybe even our freedom. I went to Jack again. This time I told him everything, including the financial fraud. He was shocked but said he would help. His plan was simple. We would collect all possible evidence against Christopher and hand it over to the relevant authorities. But there was one caveat: it could put us at risk. "Nick, you have to understand that people like him don't leave witnesses," Jack warned. I knew this, but there was no other choice. We started working together, going through financial documents, phone records, and emails. Sarah gave us everything she had, although most of it was encrypted or seemed incomprehensible. Jack had connections in the IT field, and after a few days we found what we were looking for. Evidence of illegal transactions, forged documents, and even Christopher's connections to other fraudulent schemes. But as we dug deeper, Christopher was not sitting idly by. One day, when I came home, I noticed that the door to our house was open. When I went inside, I found everything turned upside down. Sarah was sitting on the floor in the living room, her eyes red with tears. "He was here," she whispered. On the table was a paper with a short inscription: "Stop before it's too late." This was the last straw. We decided that we could no longer stay in that house. Jack helped us find a temporary shelter where we could stay while he continued to gather materials for the case. Time passed slowly, but the tension only increased. I felt that every day brought a new threat. Every call, every unfamiliar car near our hideout made me jump. One evening, Jack called and said we had enough evidence to turn over to federal agencies. He arranged a meeting with an FBI agent who had handled cases like ours. But on the way to that meeting, something happened that I will never forget. I was walking to the meeting point when I saw someone following me. It was a man in a black suit who kept a safe distance, but was clearly watching my every move. I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. I decided to test it. I changed the route, making a few extra turns. He continued to follow me. I realized that this was Christopher's man. I don't know what was driving me, but I decided to stop and confront him. I turned and said, "What do you want?" The man didn't say anything, just took his phone out of his pocket and took a picture of me. Then he turned around and left. It was like a warning. I realized that Christopher knew about our plans. I had to tell Jack. He was furious, but he said we had to move even faster now. We handed over all the materials to FBI agents that night. They assured us that they would start an investigation, but warned us that it could take time. In the meantime, we could only wait. Days of waiting turned into weeks and then into months. Sarah and I lived in constant fear. But one day we got the news. The FBI had arrested Christopher and several of his accomplices. He was accused of numerous financial crimes and even involvement in disappearances. It was the end of our nightmare. But that was not the end for Sarah and me. Although we won the battle, I couldn't forget what she had done. Her betrayal left a deep scar that will never heal. We were no longer the same people we used to be. And in the end, we decided to break up. Now I look at it all as a lesson. Life can be unpredictable and cruel, but it always gives us a chance to find our strength, even in the darkest moments. At the time of our breakup, I realized that I was holding on to something that had long been broken. My trust in Sarah was shattered, and her attempts to make things right seemed like a pale shadow of what we once had. We tried therapy, but each session was just a reminder of how far apart we had become. I decided to leave our city and start over. I moved to another state, found a new job, and even made a few new friends. But I never saw Sarah again. She stayed in our old house, trying to put her life back together, just like me. Christopher, I learned from the news, received a significant prison sentence. His empire collapsed, and people who worked for him quickly testified in exchange for a reduced sentence. As for Jack, he continued to work as a lawyer, but after everything that happened, we parted ways. It seemed to me that the whole story with Christopher was like a terrible dream that I could no longer remember in detail. One day I received a letter. It was from Sarah. She wrote that she was sorry for everything and hoped that I had found happiness. Her words sounded sincere, but I no longer felt anything for her except a slight sadness for what we had lost. I did not answer her letter. Life went on, and over time I began to find peace in it. The lessons I learned remained in my memory. Trust is a fragile thing, and a person can endure more than seems possible. My past left its marks, but it also gave me the strength to move forward. And now, when I look in the mirror, I don't see a person who has survived betrayal or danger, but a person who has found himself among the wreckage of his life. Time healed the wounds, but the scars still remained. I started visiting a small cafe near my new home where a local musician played every Saturday. His songs, although sad, had a strange calming effect, as if to say, "Everything will be fine, even if it seems impossible now." On one such evening, I noticed a woman at a neighboring table. She was immersed in a book, and her appearance radiated calmness. Our eyes met and she smiled. I returned the smile. We started talking. Her name was Emily, and she had just moved to this city after a difficult divorce. Our conversations became more frequent, and I noticed how we found common ground in the pain we had experienced. She told me that her ex-husband had been cheating on her for years, and she had tried to justify his actions for a long time before finally finding the strength to leave. With Emily, everything was easy and natural. There was no need to hide my feelings or be afraid to trust again. We took our time, both of us realizing that rushing could destroy what had just begun to emerge. My life began to be filled with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. The past did not disappear, but it no longer defined me. Over time, I realized that I had found not only a new beginning, but also something more, a new faith in myself, in people, and in the possibility of happiness even after the darkest days. Emily became not just a part of my life. She became someone I wanted to share my future with. Yes, life was not perfect. It was difficult, sometimes painful, but in the end, it was real, and I was grateful for every moment of it, even those that taught me to appreciate what I have now. Emily became my support, but not only in a romantic way. She showed me how to appreciate the little things in life, how to find joy in simple things. Together we started traveling, discovering new places and seeking peace in nature. Mountains, beaches, small towns. Each trip became a way for us to leave behind the pain and strengthen our bond. I saw her not only as someone who understood my trauma, but also as someone who inspired me to move on. Emily taught me that joy can be found even after the greatest chaos. And although sometimes the past made itself felt, her support was always there. My old world remained somewhere far away. Sarah, Christopher, Jack. They had all become part of a story that I no longer wanted to unfold. Only occasionally did moments appear in my memories that made me think about how things could have turned out differently. But these thoughts dissolved in the sounds of the present, in Emily's laughter or the rustling of the wind during our walks. Once, when we were sitting on the ocean, she asked me, "Do you think there is anything you could have changed in the past to make things better?" I thought about it, but then answered, "No. If I had changed anything, I might never have met you." She smiled, and I realized that I was telling the truth. All the difficulties and trials had brought me here, to this moment. Life could not be rewritten, but it could be accepted as it was. That night we decided to start a new tradition, to write down our dreams in a notebook, so that we could watch them come true together. The first entry was, to find a place we can call home. We continued to live in our own rhythm, enjoying every day. Every year our life was filled with a warmth that I no longer expected to find. And although the scars of the past always stayed with me, I was no longer afraid of them. They became a part of me, reminding me that even the darkest times can lead to light if you find the strength to move forward. Our search for a home became a small adventure that we decided to make special. We traveled to different cities, choosing the ones that seemed the most cozy. Emily has always been fascinated by architecture, so we often stopped by old houses, imagining how we could renovate them and fill them with life. One day, in a small town near the coast, we found the same place. It was an old house with blue shutters and a small garden. The magnolia tree that grew in the yard was blooming with white flowers, and the air was filled with the salty scent of the ocean. "That's him," Emily said, smiling as if she had seen something special. I also thought that this place was exactly what we were looking for. There was something magical here, as if the house was waiting for us. We took on the renovation together, doing everything ourselves. On weekends, we painted the walls, pulled weeds in the garden, and arranged furniture we found at local flea markets. This process brought us even closer together. We laughed, argued, and sometimes got tired, but every day we felt like we were creating something of our own. In the evening, we would often sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun go down over the horizon. Emily loved to recall how it all began, and even years later, her words still sounded to me like a promise of a better future. "We've been through so much," she once said, squeezing my hand. "But I'm glad you were there for me." I looked at her and realized that none of our old hurts mattered anymore. We had built a new life in which there was no room for fear or regret. Years passed, and our home became a place where not only our memories gathered, but also new friends, travels, and, ultimately, family. Life continued to go on as usual, but now I knew that I had a person by my side who made me stronger and happier than I could have ever imagined. And even when time changed us and the world around us, I always remembered the moment when we decided together to leave our past behind and start over. It was our second chance, and we didn't let it go to waste. Over time, our house turned into a real dream. What was once an old building with peeling paint became a cozy place we were proud to call home. In the garden, we planted flowers that reminded us of the places we had traveled. Lavender from Provence, magnolias that grew in the southern states, and even a few strawberry bushes that Emily tended with incredible love. Every detail in the house had a story. We bought the table in the living room in an antique store when we returned from a vacation at the lake. The shelves in the kitchen were made by me because Emily had seen something similar in a magazine, and I decided to try my hand at carpentry. The paintings on the walls were her drawings. She didn't call herself an artist, but her work conveyed a warmth and comfort that I couldn't see anywhere else. Our life became simple but happy. There was always music in the house. Emily loved jazz. In the evenings, we listened to old records, drank wine, and talked about everything. Those were the moments when it seemed like time was standing still and nothing else mattered. But life, as before, liked to throw up challenges. One day, as we were enjoying a casual evening on the porch, I received a letter. Not an email, but a real handwritten letter. In today's world, this was so unusual that I immediately felt anxious. "What is it?" Emily asked, seeing me nervously opening the envelope. I did not respond immediately. When I opened the letter, I saw only a few words. Asterisk, "You think you're over it, but the truth always catches up with you." There was no signature. My first reaction was panic. Who could have written this? And what did it mean? I looked at these words for a long time, trying to understand whether it was a joke or a threat. "What is it?" Emily came closer, her face frozen in alarm. "Nothing," I lied, hiding the letter. "It must be a mistake." She did not believe me, but did not insist. I hardly slept that night. The letter was like an echo from the past that I was trying to forget. The next day, I decided to take the letter to the police, but they couldn't help me. There was no signature, no trace, nothing that could point to the sender. As the days passed, I began to convince myself that it was an isolated incident. But a week later, a new letter came. Asterisk, "How long can you run from the truth?" This time I was filled with real fear. I knew it was no accident. Someone knew about my past and decided to remind me of it. But who? I hid it from Emily. I didn't want to worry her. She was my light, and I couldn't let this darken our lives. But with each new letter, it became harder for me. They came without any regularity, but always with the same message. The truth will catch up with you. One evening, when I came home from work, I saw that the door was open. There was no one inside, but there was another letter on the kitchen table. She doesn't know, but she will find out. This time I realized that they were referring to Sarah. Someone was threatening not only me, but also her. I could not keep silent any longer. That night, I told her everything about the letters, about my past, about all the mistakes I had tried to forget. She listened in silence, but her eyes spoke more than words. "I knew something was wrong," she said when I finished. "But why didn't you tell me earlier?" "I didn't want to drag you into this," I answered. "I was afraid of losing you." She took my hand and said, "We have already been through so much. We will get through this together." These words gave me hope, but I knew that this was only the beginning of the struggle for our peaceful life. I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching my every move. This feeling did not let go of me even when I tried to return to normal life. Sarah was ready to support me, but I realized that it might not be as easy as it seems. Every day the situation became more and more complicated. The person who left these letters clearly had a plan. Not only did he want to ruin my life, but he was doing it with such precision that it was frightening. I couldn't help but think that maybe someone in my inner circle was in on the plot. Someone I trusted was involved in all of this. I shared my fears with Sarah, but she was not ready to believe it. She was convinced that it was all just someone using me for manipulation and mockery. However, deep down, I felt that everything was much more serious than she could have imagined. Every detail was becoming important. And then, one day at work, I was called to the office of my boss. They didn't tell me the reason, and I could feel my heart beating faster as I walked into the room. There were only two men sitting there, my boss and another man I didn't know. He had a stern face, and he immediately became my adversary. He pointed at me and said, "Do you think it's all a coincidence? That you can hide behind words and promises?" I didn't understand what he was talking about. And then he put some photos on the table. They were photos of my wife, taken back when I thought she was at home, but in fact she was dating someone I couldn't even imagine. It was terrible. "You think I didn't see this?" I said quietly, recognizing in the photo what I had long tried to forget. My Sarah, my beloved, and someone else. My wife cheated on me, and it wasn't just a one-night stand. It was a whole plan. I was only a part of what was happening. And now this stranger was in front of me with his game, ready to make me pay for something I couldn't fix. That day I realized that my world would never be the same again. Sarah did not know that it was coming. Her sudden admission that she had been manipulated could not stop what was happening. When I came home and looked at her, my feelings were mixed: pain, anger, but also hope that at least we could get through this together. But not this time. My faith had been shattered, and that changed everything. She asked if I was ready to forgive her, if we could still save something. I wanted to say that it was possible that we could go back to the way things were. But I guess I already knew the answer. The answer was no. I could no longer trust her. And even more so, I couldn't get back what was lost. It was the end of what we had. From that moment on, I started a new stage in my life. I had to decide whether I could forget everything that had happened and keep moving forward. But one thing was clear: I couldn't go back. And then, a few months later, I met someone new. Not like before. Not with the hope of happiness, but with the hope of peace. But even that didn't bring the sense of security I was looking for. I was trapped in my past, and it didn't seem to want to let me go. That's how I stayed, watching my life unfold, watching different parts of this world turn over, but without illusions. My relationship with Sarah finally broke down. She tried to convince me that things were not as they seemed, that it was a mistake, but I no longer believed her. I could not live in a lie. My heart was devastated, and although I tried to forgive, the pain of betrayal remained in my soul. I realized that my life would never be the same again. I could not just go back. After I left home, I moved to a rented apartment in the city center. It was hard at first: loneliness, uncertainty, and the constant question of what to do next. Sarah was no longer a part of my world, and I didn't know what to do with myself. Everything I once considered my own fell apart. One day, a few months after I left everything behind, I received another letter. This time it was unsigned. The letter was simple. On the one hand, asterisk, you think it's over, but you don't know who the real enemy is yet. These words awakened a new fear in me. I did not know who could be behind all this. What was it? A new threat? Or perhaps another trap? I contacted my friends, but they didn't know what to do. I went to the place where I had worked before to try to find out more. Every step, every movement, everything was now part of some big plan, but I couldn't figure out who the author was. And then I met him, a man I had never noticed before. It was James, a colleague of mine from work who always stayed on the sidelines but had this elusive appeal. I didn't know why he made me feel uneasy, but my suspicions grew even stronger when he suddenly offered to help. I know what you are going through, and I can see how it's affecting you. But there are some things that you don't understand, he said, leaning toward me. His eyes were cold, intelligent, but also insincere. He told me what no one else could, and what I could not imagine. Sarah was just part of a bigger game. She didn't even know she was being used. The person who manipulated her was not her lover or partner. It was someone I should have trusted the most, my boss. And now I found out that the whole situation was his work. He was manipulating us. He wanted me and Sarah to be on the verge of breaking up. And now I was just a pawn in his game. And the worst part was that I didn't even realize it. My life became much more complicated than I could have imagined. It was not just a betrayal on the part of my wife, but a huge manipulation that I fell into without even realizing it. And now I had to decide how to get out of this trap, whether to continue fighting for something that had long been destroyed. But each new step brought more questions than answers. And the only thing left was to try to piece everything together and find out who was really behind it all. I still didn't know why all this had happened. But I knew one thing for sure: my life would never be the same again. This new division of reality was scary. I began to realize that even those I once considered friends could actually be part of this game. James wasn't just a coworker. He was an intermediary who was watching my every move. From the moment I learned the truth, my relationship with everyone changed. I became more cautious and more suspicious, Every move began to seem like part of a bigger game. James offered to help, but I realized that I couldn't trust even him. His words were so confident that I began to doubt everything that my reality knew. And what was even scarier was that he seemed to know my thoughts even before I expressed them. You have to realize that the fight is just beginning. You can't avoid what they have long planned, but you can change your place on the chessboard, he said, and I couldn't figure out if it was a hidden clue or just a manipulation to get me into even more chaos. At that moment, I felt everything inside me curl up. I could no longer rely on my intuition because I had been deceived all this time. James saw me, but did I see him as he really was? I decided to find out more. A week passed before I was able to sneak into James' office. In his office, I found many unusual documents that I had never seen before, and it was like opening a door to a new world that I would never have had the desire to explore. The documents were not just about work. They contained a plan divided into stages, and my name appeared in each of them. What I saw was shocking. My boss wasn't just manipulating my life. He was creating a situation where Sarah and I were becoming an integral part of his plan, using our weaknesses, our emotions, to achieve his goals. My role in all of this was very simple: to become part of a large corruption scheme that I did not even pay attention to. James, my employee, was not just a middleman. He was one of those tasked with manipulating me until I became a pawn in this chess game. I found papers that showed that they planned to destroy my reputation and use this scandal to achieve financial gains. Sarah was only a part of this plan, but what surprised me the most was that I had been targeted before it even started. She was under the control of my colleagues, not just for the sake of betrayal, but for a deeper manipulation that I did not understand. I could not understand how long I had been used and why I had been so naive. All I wanted was to find the truth, but it only confused me more. It seemed like I was part of a plan that I couldn't stop. My relationship with Sarah no longer mattered, because it was no longer a matter of betrayal. It was a matter of survival. And as I explored everything that was on the surface, I realized that my actions could change more than I ever thought possible. I could destroy this plan. I could take control. But then what? The night was dark when I got back to my apartment. James had organized another game and I was part of it. Now I had to act. I was sitting in my dark apartment, lighting a cigarette, thinking about what had happened. Many different scenarios were running through my head, but each one seemed more and more horrifying. I couldn't understand how long I had been in this dark corridor of manipulation and lies, where even those I loved were part of this dangerous game. My mind went back to Sarah. I realized that she was involved in something bigger than I could have ever imagined. She was only a tool in this regard, even though she played the role of a traitor, but her role was not just that of a betrayer. She was part of a bigger fraud in which I was the main figure. She didn't even know how deeply she was involved. Everything she did was under the influence. I couldn't forgive her, but at the same time I couldn't help but notice that her manipulations were part of a larger chain that led to my decisions. The next morning, when I got ready to go to work, I found out that Sarah had left the apartment. All her things had been taken. Why didn't I realize this before? She didn't just disappear. It was her decision, or rather, her part of the plan. I didn't have time to think about it, because my case was getting more and more complicated. James called me into the office and I realized that my future was about to be decided. I decided that I would no longer be a victim in this game. As soon as I arrived at the office, James greeted me with an expression on his face that I already knew well. He was calm, even too calm. It didn't take me long to realize that he was confident in his victory. "Are you ready for the next stage?" he asked, but I didn't answer. In his words, I did not hear a question, but preparation for the next part of the plan. And I knew that at that moment I had to act. I decided to proceed in a different way. As James continued to talk about what he needed from me, I carefully hid the microphone under the table, connecting it to the recording device in my pocket. If I couldn't take him out physically, though I doubted I could, I would at least give them a chance to get all the information they had about this conspiracy. "This isn't just a game, James," I said, straightening my back and looking him in the eye. "I know everything." Now that I was in control, I could feel my inner strength growing. James asked for a moment, "What do you mean?" He looked embarrassed, but at the same time he seemed to understand. His cold gaze said that he had been preparing for this moment for a long time. I pulled a flash drive out of my bag and put it on the table. "This is proof that you manipulated not only me, but also everyone who was around. And I am ready to expose you if necessary." James was silent at first, and then smiled slyly. "You don't realize what you've gotten yourself into. You have no idea how much I don't care about you." He nodded his head, and the next moment the office door opened. It wasn't just any other employee. It was an old acquaintance who had worked for me before, but I didn't know he was on James's side. And then it became clear that I was part of an even bigger game. "What are you going to do?" I asked, not taking my eyes off them. I hadn't expected any help, but now everything seemed too confusing to just walk away. They exchanged glances again, and only then did one of them speak. "This is not your fight. You have been part of this plan for a long time, and even what you know won't change the outcome." What I realized then was the final blow. All this time they had been manipulating me, and I was just another piece on the chessboard that they were using for their own purposes. Now that I was at the center of this game, there was only one question left. Do I fight on? Or do I just give up and become another element of this horrible plan? I didn't know the answer. I sat in my chair, watching as they quietly closed the door, and all these ideas that had been spinning in my head began to merge into one indefinite mass. They thought I was helpless, that I had already lost, and it was almost exactly as they had imagined. I had only one thing to do, to realize that everything I did was not in vain. It was not a betrayal. It was not an accident. It was my fight. I got up from my seat and walked over to the window, looking at the glare of light reflecting on the asphalt surface. It all seemed too confusing, and now I was in the center of this chess game where all these moves didn't matter. No matter how hard I tried, I realized that I could not return to my old life. James and his people, they weren't just manipulating me, they were using me to achieve their goals. But at that moment, when I was on the verge of making the final decision, I suddenly realized one important thing. I hadn't lost yet. This was just another test. It was something that would determine whether I could still stand or whether I would fall into their black vortex. I quietly approached the office door, checking to make sure I wasn't being watched. The meeting with James was only the beginning, and now that I had important information, I couldn't give them a chance to destroy me. I decided to act. I returned to my apartment, where silence still reigned. All her things had been taken away, and it was more than just an abandoned room. It was a symbol that my life would never be the same again. That evening, I connected all the devices to the computer, checking the information I had received. I had no right to be wrong. This was my last opportunity. I could feel the adrenaline filling my veins. Couldn't stop. Now that I had all the evidence, I had to send it to the right people. Otherwise, none of this made sense. And then the moment came. I pressed send. My hand trembled a little as I saw the files fall into the right hands. My struggle is not over. It has just begun. We live in a world where everyone thinks you can just leave everything behind. Simple decisions, a simple choice between yes and no. But I knew that was not the case. Now that I had taken this step, when everything was on the line, I realized that starting a new life would not be as easy as they imagined. But I couldn't just sit and wait. Every day when I woke up, I felt this tension, as if everything was surrounding me like a bad dream. Do I still have the right to call myself a man? Did I reserve the right to retaliate? I knew only one thing. I could not leave it unanswered. A few days later, I received a call. It was Sarah, my wife. I still remembered her voice, although it sounded a little different now. Barely audible, with a touch of excitement and fear. She was sure that I had forgotten everything, that I would just forget about it all. But she didn't know. She didn't know that I don't believe in betrayal. I believe in justice. Did you get the files? Her voice broke the silence, reminding me again and again of everything that had happened. I could feel my chest stabbing again. It wasn't just a question. It was a question she had to ask herself. Could she change anything? Could she ask for forgiveness? I answered briefly, yes, I got it. Silence. I listened to her, waiting to hear her explain her actions. But she only said, we have to meet. Maybe there is still a chance. Those words, that tone, none of it was true. I knew there would be no more opportunity for forgiveness. I gathered all my resolve, and although my mind was full of anger and pain, I knew that this was not just a personal vendetta. This was my fight, and I couldn't afford to lose. The meeting was scheduled for the next day. It was in the cafe where we first met. So many years ago, when there was no betrayal, when we laughed and planned our future together. Now it was all just a throbbing dark spot in my life. I came early. All these memories, they were so painful. But at the same time I realized that this was my path. It wasn't just about her and me. It was my answer to the world that you can't just leave everything like that. Sarah came in, looking just as I remembered her, a little nervous, but with a smile that looked artificial. She sat down, and before she said anything, I was ready for her to apologize, for her to try to put things back to the way they were. But it didn't happen. I looked at her and said, "You don't understand. None of this will change anything. You have made your choice." She was stunned, and I saw her eyes begin to return tears. But tears could no longer help me. This was not just a betrayal. It was manipulation. And I realized that my desire for revenge was not only a response to her betrayal. It was my way to finally let go of everything and start a new life, free from her manipulations and lies. She didn't answer, and I realized that she knew there would be no more chance for us. It wasn't cruel, it was just the right thing to do. I got up and left without looking back. It was my last meeting with Sarah. Although I could not fully understand what was ahead of me, I was ready for it. Life went on, and now I finally had a chance to be myself. For my own sake, the steps were hard, but each one gave me a feeling of liberation. I walked past her without looking back. My thoughts seemed to be covered in a fog, but at the same time I felt that these last moments with her were key to my new start. Sarah no longer had power over my soul. There was fear and disappointment in her eyes, but it didn't matter anymore. I returned home, and as I walked past our shared bed, I remembered how everything once seemed so simple, how we had laughed together, how we had promised each other that we would be together to the end. Now I was facing an empty reality, feeling relieved that I no longer had this ballast on my shoulders. Sarah wanted to save everything, but she had already lost me. She had lost my trust, and no amount of apologizing could change the fact that she was not my soulmate. Now my life had to be my own, not a continuation of something that was based only on lies. I spent the next few weeks cleaning up. I went to a therapist to deal with what had happened and figure out how to move forward. This process was difficult. All these memories of our life together, of happy moments, they still hurt, but I began to realize that pain is not the enemy. It's just a part of the process that you have to go through to be free. As I began to rebuild my life, Sarah tried to contact me, but I no longer felt the need for her presence. She still called, wrote, trying to find ways to get back what we had. And every time I received her messages, I realized that my distance from her was only growing. One day I received a strange call. It was a man I had never heard before, but his voice sounded familiar. He introduced himself as a friend of Sarah's and asked if I was willing to give the relationship another chance. I listened to him and realized more and more that this call was just another attempt at manipulation. She was hopeless. After that call, I realized one thing: I wasn't just moving forward. I was already at a different stage of my life. My experiences, my pain, and my lessons had made me stronger. Sarah lost her chance, and I accepted that. I didn't expect any more apologies from her. I let go, and that was the only thing I could do for myself. Life went on, but now I felt free, confident, and ready for everything that lay ahead. With each new day, I felt my confidence grow. What seemed incorrigible before became an important part of my growth. I started to value myself again. Now I knew that I was worth more than staying in a relationship that was based on betrayal. I started to meet new people, build new friendships, and even return to my old hobbies that I hadn't done for a long time. It was important not only to leave the past behind, but also to understand what was important to me in the future. I started to set new goals, not limiting myself to what I had before. I started working on my own projects, regained my physical fitness, and rediscovered the small joys of life that I had long forgotten. But of course, the reality was not as easy as it seemed at first glance. As time went on, I realized that my heart hadn't completely forgotten Sarah. From time to time, I would experience memories of our past together, moments when we laughed together, when I believed in her and in our future. However, I quickly realized that these memories were no longer my present. A cafe on the other side of town. When I arrived, she was already waiting. She was different, not the way I remembered her. Her eyes were heavy with tears, and her movements seemed more sloppy. She was silent, as if she was trying to find the right words. We sat in silence for several minutes before she spoke. "I don't know how to explain it," she said, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake, and I'm afraid I've lost you forever." I didn't answer right away. The words I could have said did not come out of my mouth. How can you forgive such a betrayal? How can you forget how you felt when you found out the truth? All these questions were running through my head, but I knew that my emotions no longer had the power to change the situation. "You can say it was a mistake, but that won't change what happened," I said, looking at her. "We can't bring back the time when everything was simple." She held her gaze, but I could see her struggling with what had happened. She already knew that my decision was not just about betrayal, it was about the loss of trust, about everything I could no longer get from our past. She was silent, and then I realized that there would be no turning back. Her words, her explanations, none of it mattered, because from the moment we went off that path, we became different people. My trust had been broken, and now we were at a crossroads where there was no more room for forgiveness. I stood up and took one last look at Sarah. "I wish you happiness, but I can't be a part of it," I said, and without looking back, I walked away, leaving her alone with her choice and her pain. It was the last meeting. I did not allow myself to go back to it again. Now I knew that life goes on, and I had to find a way forward. We could no longer be together, and although part of me was still in pain, the other part finally felt the heavy shadow of betrayal fading. My footsteps echoed in the empty street as I walked home. The wind was cold, but it seemed to me that this was exactly the cold reality I had finally come to. All that was left was the question of how to go on living after what had happened. I had no answer. The words she had said to me had no power to change what had happened, but they still sounded in my head like an echo. I couldn't help but wonder if I had really made the right choice. Was I too quick in my decision? Is there a chance to fix it? But when I walked into my house, I felt that emptiness again. The emptiness that I had been trying to fill for so long. But now I realized that this pain would not disappear instantly. Not now. Maybe never. I took off my jacket, put my keys on the table, sat down on the couch, and lit a cigarette. It was my old ritual. A cigarette after all the difficulties, when you don't know what to do next. As usual, it didn't bring any relief, but at least it helped me to gather my thoughts together. Images of Sarah, her look, her words, were running through my head. I tried to remember when we started to lose contact, when everything started to fall apart. But there were no answers. She had always been my support, and now I couldn't even imagine where she was, who she was to me now. I felt the heaviness start to come back. I looked at the clock and noticed that it was getting late. I had no desire to go back to work the next day, no desire to do anything. But I couldn't stay in this state. I was tired of the loneliness and the pain that wouldn't leave me. It was a fight I couldn't win if I kept sitting at home looking back. I needed to change something. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. Over the next few days, I tried to find a way to move on, to find myself. I went to the gym, started doing something that used to distract me, but it wasn't enough. My thoughts kept coming back to Sarah. They wouldn't let me go, wouldn't let me forget. Then I realized that the only way to deal with it was to get out of this situation forever, to forget what had happened and move forward. But I wasn't ready to let go completely, and I made another mistake along the way. One evening, as I was sitting in a bar drinking a beer and watching people, a strange woman approached me. She was attractive, but something in her gaze, in her eyes, was similar to what I was looking for, a way to escape reality. "You look like someone who needs to talk," she said. I looked at her smile, and something inside me began to collapse. I was ready to plunge into anything that would somehow ease the pain, escape from what had happened, and maybe find relief. It was stupid, and I knew it, but I couldn't stop. After several hours of conversation, I found that I could not let go of this moment. She offered me another drink, and I said yes. I didn't know why I was doing it anymore, but my hands were going to where the pain was, to a new person, to something else that could distract me from reality. But I could not force myself to forget what had happened. My mind kept coming back to Sarah, to what she was, to what happened between us. And when I woke up the next morning, I realized that my path to oblivion was just another mistake. Now I saw it clearly. I couldn't just end the pain by making new connections or running away. I couldn't just find a replacement for what we had. Now I had to make a choice. Either move on with my own wounded feelings or leave everything behind and start a new life. Maybe I wasn't ready for it, but I knew it was my last chance. The next step was up to me. Only I could decide what to do with the void she left behind. I woke up every morning thinking about how it was. Sarah, her betrayal, her words, my feelings which changed but didn't go away. I couldn't ignore it even when I tried to convince myself that I could. In every little thing I found memories of us, how we laughed together, how we planned our future. All of that was now in ruins. I knew I needed to move on, but part of me was still not ready for it. I still cherished those moments when we were happy together. And no matter how hard I tried to get rid of that past, it seemed to hold me in its arms. The day I met that strange woman in the bar, I thought it might be the moment that would help me escape from this trap. I was lonely, and although I tried not to show it, I could feel myself being consumed by despair. However, later I realized that this was just another attempt to escape from reality. And this was enough to realize that my scars, my experiences, all of this has to go away, and I have to allow myself to heal, even though it is difficult. I started to spend more time with myself. I worked, went for walks, met with friends. None of them knew the real reasons for my changed behavior, and I wasn't going to tell them. I was so absorbed in my pain that it was hard for me to realize that even now I was still thinking about Sarah. One evening I received a message from her. Simple, without any explanation. Just a few words that she sent as if trying to get my attention again. "I miss you. Maybe we can talk." I didn't answer right away. I sat looking at the phone screen. The feeling came back again. It was a struggle. What should I do? Am I really ready to get myself involved in this whirlwind again? Or should I finally let her go? A few days passed, and I decided that I needed to resolve this once and for all. I wrote her back, "We can't be together anymore." I decided that I needed to move forward, that I didn't want to be a part of this story anymore. Openly and honestly, even if it was painful. I heard a new message on my phone and felt a heavy breath when I saw her reply, "I understand. I knew you would say that. Maybe this is the best thing for both of us." The feeling that gripped me after these words was strange. It was as if everything had fallen away, as if I had severed the connection with the past and could now start a new life. Although this path was difficult and full of pain, I still felt that I had made the right choice. That evening I sat in silence, thinking about how much had changed. I realized that even when we let go of someone who was important to us, we don't lose ourselves. Rather, we find ourselves again. And although this process can be painful, it is necessary in order to move on. I wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but I knew that I had a chance to create a new story where I would be happy. The next few weeks were a time of self-discovery for me. I began to devote more time to my interests, tried to return to old hobbies that I had lost during my relationship with Sarah. I started painting, although I was not a professional. It became a way of recovery for me, a kind of therapy for my soul. And with every stroke of paint I put on the canvas, I felt my heart healing. But not everything was so perfect. Some nights I would wake up thinking about her. The memories of how we laughed, how we shared dreams, came back, and even when I tried to push them away, they remained, like ghosts from the past. At such moments, I felt like I hadn't fully let go of her yet. And although I knew it was the right thing to do, part of me missed what we had. But over time, I realized that it was an illusion created by pain. I started dating other people, but none of these encounters made the impression on me that I had hoped to get. There was no feeling that I had with Sarah at the beginning of our acquaintance, the emotional synergy that seemed so strong. I started to doubt whether there would be anyone else who could be what she was for me. But it was also a moment of realization. There was no need to compare. I just had to find myself, regardless of whether there would be anyone else in my life. One day, a few months after I finally ended my relationship with Sarah, I received a message from her friend Kate. We hadn't talked for a long time, but we knew each other from my time with Sarah. Kate wrote that she wanted to meet and talk. At first, I didn't understand why it was important, but her message had some weight. She wasn't just a friend of Sarah's. She was a woman I respected and had a pretty good relationship with. We met in a cafe a few days later. Kate looked anxious, and I realized that this was not going to be a friendly conversation. As soon as we sat down, she started. "I don't know how to tell you this, but Sarah, she's going through a bad time. She's very sorry." I shuddered, not knowing what to say. All my feelings were back in place, but I didn't want to go back to the old thoughts and pain. "She can't forgive herself," Kate continued. "It's all become more than she can take. She wants to talk to you. I know it's not going to be easy, but she doesn't know how to move forward, and it's hard for her to leave everything behind." I didn't know how to react. What should I do with this information? And is it really important? Maybe it was just another attempt to make me feel sorry for him. In the end, I decided that this issue should be resolved by myself, not through intermediaries. I agreed to meet with Sarah. That evening, I found myself back at the very place where it all began, in a cafe we often visited together. Sarah was sitting at a table with her head bowed, her eyes full of sadness and regret. She looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that was not there when we broke up. Her expression was not overtly apologetic, but there was something deeper in it that reflected her change. "Hello," she said, her voice quiet, almost unnoticeable. "Hi," I answered, trying to look calm, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. I don't know where to start," she said, looking around as if trying to find the words. "I realize it's too late, and you probably don't want to hear this, but I'm really sorry." I was silent, not knowing how to react. All these emotions that I had been trying to hide suddenly came out. It was the moment when all my decisions and actions from the past, all my thoughts about how to move forward, came to a head. And even now, when I was clearly aware of everything, I didn't know if I was ready to let go of what had happened. "I want you to know," Sarah continued, "I don't want to change your life, but I want you to understand that I was not strong when this happened. I broke down and I want to change things now. I want real forgiveness." Those words came to me, but I didn't know how to deal with them. The silence between us became heavy, and I could feel every second tightening, like an invisible chain tightening around me. I sat there looking at Sarah, trying to understand what I was really feeling. All these months of trying to pick up my soul and move forward, it all seemed so far away, so unimportant. Now that she was in front of me again, with her apology and regret, I began to question what I really wanted. "You want me to forgive you?" I asked, trying to find some clarity in my thoughts. "Are you saying that everything will be different now? How am I supposed to believe you, Sarah? How am I supposed to come back to you after everything that's happened?" She looked down as if those words were heavier than any physical blows. I saw her shoulders shake slightly, and it mixed with my own feelings. I could feel my pulse racing, but I also felt that this moment would not be the one that would change everything. Everything I had been through could not be erased with an apology. "I can't change what happened," she said, her voice quiet but with a determination I hadn't seen before. "I broke you, and I realize that can't be fixed, but I want you to know that I am ready to work on myself. I am ready to change what I have destroyed." Those words sank into my soul, but it did not give me a sense of comfort. There was still that pain, the pain that hadn't left me since the moment I learned the truth. I began to realize that apologies could not destroy it. I couldn't go back to the time when everything was perfect, and I couldn't rebuild the trust that she and I had built together. What would I do if I took her back? Would it mean that I would let her lie to me again as she did before? Am I ready to trust her? "I don't know," I said, swallowing hard. "I don't know if I can forgive this. I don't know if I can open my heart again." Sarah remained silent, and I saw her face change, a shadow of pain running through her eyes. It was not an easy moment for her, and I realized that despite all her apologies, she also had her punishment, the feeling that she had lost me. But I was no longer the same person I was before the betrayal. I had become a different person, and maybe that's what made me feel like my path was the right one, even if it meant leaving her behind. "You can go this way, and I won't stand in your way," she said, standing up. I didn't answer right away. I thought that was the end of our story. I went home and just sat in silence, thinking about what had happened and what I would do now. Life went on, but my feelings for Sarah were not the same as before. I felt that it was the end, even though I didn't have the strength to say it definitively. How could I be with her after everything that had happened? How could I build again what had been destroyed? I remembered how she used to laugh when we were happy, and now I knew that this laughter belonged to another era. This stage was over and I had to move on, even if it was hard. I could not be with someone who betrayed me. My soul was completely wounded, and I realized that this was the last attempt at a relationship I could give her. At that moment, I felt that I was moving on, even though I didn't fully understand what lay ahead. But I was no longer looking for answers in the past. I was just looking for peace within myself. A few days after Sarah left, I still couldn't understand why it all happened. Was I so blind that I didn't notice her changes? Or was it simply the result of me being too focused on work and other things that allowed her lies and manipulation to flourish? I couldn't find an answer to these questions. After she left, I started spending more time with friends I trusted. Sometimes they would try to ask about her, but I couldn't talk about it without feeling pain. It was so painful, so meaningless, as if a part of me had just gone away and left me empty. But as time went on, I started to feel my heart recovering, even if it wasn't as easy as I expected. I started doing more things for myself, resuming old habits that I enjoyed, going for runs, signing up for workouts, reading books I had long forgotten. Over time, I think I finally started to feel a little bit alive again. One day, while I was sitting in a coffee shop reading a new book, a strange girl approached me. She was free. She didn't feel any pressure. And at first glance, I noticed that there was a different kind of light in her eyes, unlike anything I had ever seen in Sarah. "Hi," she said, smiling. "You look like someone who needs to talk. Can I sit next to you?" I smiled and nodded. We started talking, and although I again felt the same emotional distance I had always felt after the betrayal, something about her openness and sincerity caught my attention. She didn't try to appear different, didn't hide her feelings. From time to time, when I would sit down for meetings with people or just be alone, I would still think about Sarah. I thought about what had happened and why it had happened the way it had. But I no longer felt the oppression that I had experienced before. Would I ever have another chance at love? Would I ever be able to open my heart again? I was no longer looking for answers in the past. I was ready to look to the future. One day, after a few months of getting to know the girl I met in the coffee shop, I realized one important thing. I finally knew how to forgive. And although I no longer wanted Sarah back in my life, I realized that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. It means letting go so that you can move on. And so I started moving. Not backwards to what was broken, but forward to new opportunities and a new life. And although it was difficult, I knew that now I had more strength to move forward. Months passed, and my life slowly took on new dimensions. I started traveling more, visiting places I had always dreamed of seeing, and meeting new people. All these changes helped me to recover, and I realized that even in spite of the pain, you can find the strength to go on. Over time, I became much more confident. Meetings with the girl I met in the coffee shop became more regular. Her name was Lisa, and she was a real breath of fresh air after everything that had happened. She was direct, interesting, and not afraid to be herself. I felt comfortable with her, as if I started to trust people again, although part of me was still afraid of betrayal. We spent a lot of time with Lisa, and each time I noticed how my wound was healing. She was attentive, listened carefully to my stories, and always supported me in those moments when I was worried. But despite this, I could not get rid of the fear that something like this could happen again. I had another big uncertainty. Could I trust a woman completely again? One evening, after a few months of being together, Lisa suggested that we go on a short vacation together in the mountains. It was an opportunity for the two of us to be together, away from all the problems and noise of the city. I agreed, although there was that little fear again that something might go wrong. But I tried to ignore it, enjoying the moment. It was wonderful in the mountains. We spent time in nature, walking through the forests, conquering peaks, and just talking while watching the sunset. She looked happy, and I felt like I could be happy again. And even when I woke up at night from nightmares about betrayal, Lisa was there, just holding my hand, letting me know that everything would be okay. One morning, when we woke up after a long night, Lisa looked at me with a serious expression. "I want to tell you something important," she said, trying to avoid my gaze. I froze. My reaction was instantaneous. Thoughts of betrayal filled my head again. Maybe it was her again, hiding something from me? What happened? I tried to remain calm, although I could hear fear in my voice. Lisa took a deep breath and looked at me with tenderness. "I should have told you this earlier. I'm pregnant." The whole world seemed to freeze. I could not understand what she had just said. My reaction was unexpected, even for me. I sat down on the bed, unable to believe that this had really happened. My thoughts changed dramatically. At first, I felt a wave of joy. Lisa and I were really close, and I imagined us raising a child together. But then I started to panic. What if it wasn't my child? This is... How? My words seemed stingy and illegible. Lisa calmly explained that she had taken a test and that the baby was really mine. She was sure that this was a new chapter in our lives. But for me, it was another challenge, another test of my ability to trust. And although I tried to be calm, I felt deep doubts. What if Lisa was hiding something? What if this situation is just another way that my fate can play a cruel game with me? I tried to leave my fears behind and focus on the present moment. I couldn't forget about my history with Sarah, but I felt that this was a new chance for me to start from scratch. Over time, I accepted the fact that I was going to be a father. I decided to step forward and build a new life with Liza, even if my doubts sometimes covered me with waves of uncertainty. Every day was a step for me to open a new chapter that I could write instead of living in the past. And so, although fear and distrust still sometimes appeared in my life, I realized that new beginnings were not only a chance for happiness, but also an opportunity to find calm in the midst of the storm. I was no longer the same person I was with Sarah. I became stronger, wiser, and ready to face life again, even if it brought even more surprises. With each passing day, as Lisa became more and more obviously pregnant, I began to realize how important it was for me to be at her side. All my previous worries, fears, and doubts seemed smaller as I looked at her growing belly. It was a new reality, a reality where I couldn't afford to run away from responsibility, where I needed to stand up and be a real man for her and for our future child. We started planning how we would set up our new home, choosing names for the baby, laughing and joking together as if there was nothing else in the world but the two of us. But I couldn't forget how hard it was for me to rebuild trust. Even now, with Lisa, it was easier to forgive her because I realized that she had nothing to do with what had happened to me in the past. But still, this shadow remained. The shadow of betrayal that lives in my heart. I didn't know if I would ever be able to fully trust someone again. One evening, when Lisa and I were walking in the park, she suddenly stopped and looked at me with a serious expression. "I have to tell you something," she said quietly, and I felt my heart beat faster. My hand on her back froze, and I felt the same anxiety that had been bothering me all along rise up inside me. The idea that her words could be something like my past history came flooding back. What happened? I tried to look calm, although I could feel fear in my eyes. Lisa took my hand, and her eyes were full of sadness. "I need you to know this." She took a breath and looked me in the eye. "I'm not just pregnant. According to all the tests, the baby is not yours." My heart stopped. Everything in my soul was cut off, and I could not believe what I was hearing. All the feelings I had been accumulating over the past months seemed empty. I felt as if someone had ripped my heart out right in front of me. Lisa, was I a victim again? How can this be? I could not say another word. Lisa looked down. I was with someone before we started dating, and this person, he was a part of my life while I was trying to get rid of the past. But I found out too late that I was pregnant, and when I took a test, it turned out to be his child. I never wanted to hide this from you, and I realize it's hard. But I don't know what to do. I stood there in silence, unable to take in everything she said. All my confidence in us, in our future, seemed to sink into the darkness. Was this another betrayal? Or just the result of her confusing relationship before we started? I felt incredibly angry and hurt at the same time. She looked at me with eyes full of remorse, but it didn't matter to me now. It was the same bitterness I had experienced with Sarah, but now it was coming from Lisa. What makes a person lie? What could be so important that they would hide the truth until the very last moment? Why didn't you tell me earlier? Why, Lisa? My voice was shaking with rage. Lisa took a deep breath and gently shook my hand. I was afraid. I was afraid that you would leave me, that everything would fall apart. I knew how important being a father was to you and how hard it was to trust you. I just couldn't lose you again. But now I know I can't live with this lie. I didn't know what to say. My heart was torn, and I couldn't understand whether I was capable of forgiving her. Maybe I stayed with Lisa because I didn't want to be alone. Perhaps it was only a desire to preserve something that was so close to what I imagined to be true happiness. But at that moment, I realized that I could no longer go through life with only illusions. Lisa was there, trying to find a way to reconcile, but I was already too far away to return to her. I slowly started to back away, feeling the walls around me start to grow. I don't know if I can forgive this, Lisa. I need time. I may never be able to forgive you. She answered quietly, silently accepting my words. She turned slowly, and I watched her walk away, leaving me with my thoughts, my pain, and my doubts. This time the betrayal was no longer just a tragedy. It was a new ending, and maybe even the beginning of something new for me. Weeks passed, but I could not get rid of this feeling of betrayal that had settled tightly in my heart. Lisa kept trying to apologize. She brought flowers, wrote messages, called, but I couldn't answer. It was hard to put into words what I was feeling, and even more so, I wasn't sure if she even wanted to understand how deeply it hurt me. I tried to decide what to do next. It turned out that the best thing was to just leave everything behind. If only it were that simple. But I couldn't just throw away what we had. I remembered how we laughed together, how we shared our dreams and plans. But I knew that now I was looking at it all through different eyes. The eyes of a man who had survived a betrayal, eyes that no longer believed in simple words and promises. At that time, I became even more withdrawn and detached. I began to spend a lot of time at work, trying to immerse myself in a routine so as not to think about it. However, no amount of work helped to drown out the voice in my head that kept bringing me back to that situation. How could I get over it? How could I continue to live with the fact that the child was not mine? One evening after I got home, I came across an old box of photos. It was in the closet, forgotten, covered in dust. All those pictures with Lisa, our friend's family, made me think again. Was I blind? Were there signs that I just didn't notice because I wanted to believe in us so much? I took out one photo of Lisa and me on our honeymoon. Her smile was so pure and sincere that I could hardly breathe. I couldn't just let it all go. I couldn't forget what we had experienced together. And at that moment I felt that I needed to decide whether I was trying to find a way back, or whether I was finally leaving it behind. But life did not give me time to think. One day, after several months of silence, Lisa reappeared in my life. She came to my house unannounced and said she wanted to talk. "I know this is hard for you," she said, sitting across from me on the couch, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I had to tell you the truth. And I know that it all looks like I betrayed you, and maybe I did. But I want you to understand one thing. I love you, and I still want to be with you." I remained silent. It was the same Lisa, but this time her eyes were not just dubiously anxious, but also genuine remorse. She put her hand on mine. "I made a mistake," she continued. "And I know I can't justify it, but I want us to start over. Maybe not the same way as before, but still. You are important to me." I closed my eyes, trying to organize my thoughts. I might be able to forgive, but would I ever feel that same unconditional trust again? Will I ever be able to be with the one I loved again, but who let me down at the worst possible moment? Looking at her quietly, I said, "Lisa, I want to believe that you have changed, but I don't know if I will ever be able to forget everything that happened." She bowed her head, her eyes full of tears. "I understand," she answered quietly, "and I'm ready to wait. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make you trust me again. Will we be able to rebuild our relationship? Will our love be able to return after everything that happened?" I didn't know yet, but I promised myself that I would no longer live in a world of illusions. Now, it had to be not just a choice, but a real decision. Time passed, but I couldn't get rid of the constant feeling of doubt living in my soul. Lisa tried to justify herself, tried every day to prove to me that she had changed, that she was the real her, not the one who had betrayed me. She helped out at home, tried to be caring and thoughtful. It really looked like an attempt to regain my trust, but I still couldn't get used to what had happened. Every time she touched me, when our eyes crossed, I remembered that night, and it was getting harder. If not for that day, if not for that mistake, we could have had a future together. And I wondered whether it was possible to simply forgive such a betrayal, whether it was just a reminder that each of us has our dark sides. Lisa never stopped trying to restore our relationship. She even suggested that we spend a vacation together, somewhere far away from this place where it all started and where the shadow of her betrayal still lingered. At first I was negative, but then I realized that this could be a chance for me. Maybe I could finally free myself from these memories, from these painful images that arise in my head every time I see her. We went to the mountains. Nature, fresh air, silence. All this helped to distract me a bit, and it seems that it was there, alone among the vast forests and mountains, that I first heard Lisa open up to me. She admitted that she had not just cheated, but that she had problems in her life that she could not solve on her own. She told me that she often felt unhappy and that her former love was not a real support for her. She was wrong, and as hard as it was for her to accept, she realized that the real problem was her fears and insecurities. These words made me think. Was I a part of her pain? Could I have changed anything when we were both on the verge of collapse? If I had paid more attention, maybe things would have looked different. After a few days in the mountains, we returned home. We spent all those days together, but questions kept popping up in my head. How can I forgive her for what happened? How can I forget about what she did to us? Is it worth trying to fix it all? Or should I let her go to move on? And now, back to reality, I received a message from her ex. He wrote me that he wanted to meet. I already knew it wouldn't be good, but I went. When I opened the door, I saw him with other people. He looked at me with this unknown smile, and then I realized that he was also a part of her life, which made my decision even more difficult. Betrayal was not only her side, but also his. We didn't talk about Lisa anymore, but all those hours spent together allowed me to make an important choice. Now I realized that there are things that simply cannot be returned, cannot be restored. I forced myself to accept that. Apologies will not change what happened. Lisa was a part of my life, but no more. And now I had to be ready for a new stage. And so, on that night, when I closed the door behind me, leaving all my painful memories behind, I felt that I was free. And not because I left her, but because I realized that the betrayal made me look at myself, at my limits. I was able to change my life without regard to her. It was a hard fight, but I finally got to that point. Now that I was free of the past, I was ready to move on. When I returned to my normal life, everything fell into place, but in a different way. It seemed as if nothing had changed, but in fact I had become a different person. All this time, after experiencing betrayal, I realized one important thing. Sometimes we look for something in other people that we cannot find in ourselves. And even the biggest mistakes can be a lesson. Lisa was still trying to get me to talk, but I was no longer the same man who had been living in anticipation of change a few months earlier. I was no longer bothered by her concern or apologies. I started asking myself, why did I stay? Why did I come back again? And the answer was simple. I was afraid to be alone. But now, Looking at myself in the mirror, I realized that loneliness is not so scary. It's scary to stay in a relationship where you don't feel happy. I packed my things, and despite Lisa's best attempts to convince me that she had changed, I decided to move. It was a hard step, but I knew it was the only right choice. Lisa stayed in our apartment, and I took my things and moved to a small rented room on the outskirts of the city. Weeks and then months passed, and I began to develop my life anew. I began to devote more time to my work, hobbies, and friends. I returned to my old hobbies, started going to workouts, visiting new places. All this gave me the feeling that I was living, that I could be happy without depending on anyone else. Suddenly, I started meeting new people, even though I wasn't looking for a relationship. One evening, at a meeting with a friend, I met Sophia, a young woman who had recently moved to the city. She was completely different from Lisa. She had no doubts about her desires. She was confident. And although I wasn't ready for a new relationship, Sophia started paying attention to me. But I knew I had to wait to take my time. I began to be attentive to myself again, realizing that if I allowed myself to enter into a new relationship, it would be only after I had completely rebuilt my psyche so as not to repeat the mistakes of the past. And Sophia understood this. She was patient and did not try to force me to make quick decisions. Gradually, something real was emerging between us, but not as high and not as cruel as it had been in previous relationships. This time, I had to be sure of my feelings, not remain obligated or closed off. After a while, I started to notice Sophia slowly penetrating my heart, but I knew that before I could start trusting again, I had to go all the way through. I was in no hurry, but felt free and relaxed, without any pressure. And it was the right thing to do. Life after betrayal can feel empty and confusing, but over time I realized that it doesn't end with one person. There are so many opportunities to start building your happiness again. As long as you're not afraid to let go of the past and give yourself a chance at a new one. I continued to rebuild my life after all those difficult months. Every day I felt better, although sometimes nothing could completely heal the wounds left by the betrayal. They were deep inside me, like painful memories, but over time I learned to live with them. They were no longer my burdens. I learned to accept them as part of my experience. Sophia was patient and understanding. She did not demand anything from me, did not try to replace Lisa or make hasty changes in our communication. She was just there for me, ready to be my support whenever I felt I needed time. And maybe that's why something real was brewing between us. I started to appreciate those simple moments that used to seem ordinary. Walking together in the park, spending evenings together over a cup of coffee, or discussing books, movies, or even ordinary little things that usually go unnoticed in a world that revolves around work and worries. But at some point I started to notice that the past was coming back, even when I tried to resist it. One day I received a message from Lisa. At first I felt a wave of irritation. I even wanted to ignore her attempts to re-enter my life. But I decided that this time I would be different. I would not avoid, hide, or let my emotions control me. I said, "We have to talk," she wrote. I wasn't sure I really wanted to hear it, so I simply suggested meeting in a neutral place, a coffee shop in the city center where we used to hang out a lot. When I saw Lisa, she looked nothing like I remembered. She was less confident, as if she was exhausted by something. Maybe I was just noticing her weaknesses that I had previously hidden in my eyes, or maybe it was the result of the betrayal I had been so afraid of. "I know you probably don't want to see me, but I need to tell you something," she began. I sat in silence, not knowing what she meant. She sighed heavily and continued, "I am very sorry that I did all that back then. I realized that I had lost you. I lost us, and I don't know if there's a chance to fix anything, but I want you to know that I've changed." Her words were like an echo of my old fears. I had long since stopped looking for answers to the questions that were still running through my head, but she again put a great dilemma in front of me. Should I open the door to the past if that past has already changed my present so much? I looked at her with a smile, but not the one that had once been treacherous. It was a smile that no longer contained pain. I was ready to listen to her, but I knew that my decisions no longer depended on her words. I was different, and although I understood her and even felt sorry for her, I knew that this was no longer my path. "You've already made your choice, Lisa. We all made our choices, and it's okay if our paths don't cross anymore," I replied calmly, realizing that this moment would bring neither forgiveness nor answers to all questions. It was just the closing of one important chapter in my life. After that meeting, I finally let go of everything related to Lisa. I felt no anger or resentment toward her, only an understanding that sometimes you can't get back what you've already lost. And even when old emotions flared up, I knew I was going in the right direction. Things only got better with Sophia. We took our time, but perhaps that's why our bond became stronger than I could have imagined. There were many simple moments in our life, and it was these moments that began to define my true happiness. I realized that every step, every choice, and every mistake I had made had led me to become who I was today. And although the past had left its marks, it no longer had any power over my future. It was a time of change. I finally began to feel that life was taking on a new meaning. There were no longer those heavy thoughts that I used to be unable to get out of my head. Now I realized that my heart could open up to true love again. Sophia was there, and although I wasn't ready to give myself over to these new feelings right away, I felt that she deserved to be a part of my life. We often spent our evenings together, taking our time and enjoying every moment. She was patient, wise, and understanding. I thanked fate for her appearance, because I began to see in her what I had been missing after Lisa. She helped me to believe in people again, in my ability to love, and I realized that it was more than just recovering from pain. It was the beginning of something new. One evening we were sitting on the couch, drinking wine and talking about everything. Although it was an ordinary evening, it was a special moment for me. We didn't talk about betrayal or the past. We talked about what was happening now, what might happen in the future, and even how we wanted to live our lives. I felt that Sophia and I were on the same page. But one day when I came home from work, I was greeted by a message from Lisa. She wrote just a few words. "I'm having a hard time and I want to talk." I was overcome with excitement. The feeling that this could change everything was alarming, but I didn't allow myself to let my emotions get the better of me. I replied that I could meet, but only in a couple of days. I wasn't ready for it, but I felt that it was still part of my journey, part of what needed to be completed. When I saw Lisa the next day, she was completely different. She was not the same stubborn, self-assured woman I had lived with years ago. She looked somehow lost, even confused. Her eyes didn't have the sparkle I remembered. She sat in front of me in silence, and I saw so much pain in her eyes. "I made a mistake," she said quietly. "I realize I can't take it back, but I want you to know that I know I made a huge mistake." I looked at her and felt that familiar pain again, but now it was not so sharp. Maybe it was just a memory, but I didn't want the past to take over again. I couldn't afford to go back to where I had already been. I took a deep breath and said, "Lisa, I understand that you are sorry, but it doesn't matter to me anymore. My path was chosen when you made your decision, and I don't want it to become a part of my life again. You have the right to make your own choices, and I have the right to make mine." Her eyes became even sadder, but she didn't object. I saw that she really understood everything I had said, and maybe even she needed this closure herself. She got up and slowly walked away, not looking back, and although my heart was still beating a little from that pain, I knew it was the right decision. I returned to Sophia, and our relationship only grew deeper. It was not just a new start, but a real rebuilding from scratch. We worked on ourselves and our future together. I felt a new life blossoming, without betrayal and pain, without a past that could no longer hold me back. And although I no longer live in the shadow of that betrayal, I have learned to appreciate those who are close to me. And this is the one thing I will never forget. My life gradually entered a new track. I didn't even realize that I would be able to find peace after all this happened. But with each new day I felt stronger, more able to cope with the pain. Sophia, with her patience and support, became for me something I did not expect to find in this world. Hope. But with hope came responsibility. I began to appreciate what I had more and did everything I could to make our future the way I envisioned it. I never thought that after everything collapsed, I would be able to build a new reality without looking back at the past. But Sophia showed me that there are other ways to see the world. She was able to forgive, despite what I had been through. She understood my anxieties, my doubts, and even when I was afraid to open up completely, she found a way to support me. But one day, when I came home earlier than usual, I saw her sad face. She was sitting on the couch, looking somehow exhausted, with a look that could not hide the internal struggle. I went over to her, sat down next to her, and asked her what was wrong. Did I do something wrong? Her voice was quiet, as if she was afraid to ask, even though she already knew the answer. I realized that it was more than just a concern for me or our future. It was something more, something that had been hovering between us since the moment we got together. That moment when it is impossible to avoid the events of the past that even after a long time echo in your heart. "No," I answered, not knowing how to respond. "But I can see that something has happened. Can you tell me what's bothering you?" She was silent, trying to collect her thoughts. Then, finally, she said, "There's something I haven't told you, something I've been hiding, thinking it would be better. But now I can't keep it inside anymore." I didn't know what to expect. My soul was already ready for any shock. Her words hung in the air, and I felt my heart beat faster. "What is it?" I asked, trying to remain calm. even though everything was boiling inside me. I was in a relationship before we met. I'm really afraid you'll be disappointed, but I was in a relationship with your friend. Before we started dating. It was a surprise. I could not believe my ears. That friend with whom we were vacationing together trusted each other. Everything that I had built in my head was suddenly turned upside down. My heart stopped for a moment, and I didn't know how to react. How could you? Was all I could say. My mind was filled with chaos. She lowered her head, silently waiting for me to calm down. I didn't want you to find out, she continued. It was a big mistake, and I tried to put it behind me from the beginning, but now I can't live with this secret anymore. I felt the pain reappear, familiar and bitter. Although I wanted to forgive her, I couldn't hide the feeling of betrayal. This friend was important to me, and my love, which I thought was so pure, had failed me again. I couldn't understand why she couldn't have been open with me from the beginning. I lost my cool, and we were silent for a long time, each of us experiencing what had happened. Finally, I looked her in the eye and said, "We need to talk about this, and I don't know what to do next." And although I tried to be strong and composed, a real fire was burning inside me. Would I be able to trust her again? Should we continue this journey together? The situation was complicated, and the solution was not as obvious as I had initially thought. My life gradually entered a new track. I didn't even realize that I would be able to find peace after all this happened. But with each new day, I felt stronger, more able to cope with the pain. Sophia, with her patience and support, became for me something I did not expect to find in this world: hope. But with hope came responsibility. I began to appreciate what I had more and did everything I could to make our future the way I envisioned it. I never thought that after everything collapsed, I would be able to build a new reality without looking back at the past. But Sophia showed me that there are other ways to see the world. She was able to forgive, despite what I had been through. She understood my anxieties, my doubts, and even when I was afraid to open up completely, she found a way to support me. But one day, when I came home earlier than usual, I saw her sad face. She was sitting on the couch, looking somehow exhausted, with a look that could not hide the internal struggle. I went over to her, sat down next to her, and asked her what was wrong. Did I do something wrong? Her voice was quiet, as if she was afraid to ask, even though she already knew the answer. I realized that it was more than just a concern for me or our future. It was something more, something that had been hovering between us since the moment we got together. That moment when it is impossible to avoid the events of the past that even after a long time echo in your heart. "No," I answered, not knowing how to respond. "But I can see that something has happened. Can you tell me what's bothering you?" She was silent, trying to collect her thoughts. Then, finally, she said, "There's something I haven't told you, something I've been hiding, thinking it would be better. But now I can't keep it inside anymore. I didn't know what to expect." My soul was already ready for any shock. Her words hung in the air, and I felt my heart beat faster. "What is it?" I asked, trying to remain calm, even though everything was boiling inside me. I was in a relationship before we met. I'm really afraid you'll be disappointed, but I was in a relationship with your friend. Before we started dating. It was a surprise. I could not believe my ears. That friend with whom we were vacationing together trusted each other? Everything that I had built in my head was suddenly turned upside down. My heart stopped for a moment, and I didn't know how to react. How could you? Was all I could say. My mind was filled with chaos. She lowered her head, silently waiting for me to calm down. I didn't want you to find out, she continued. It was a big mistake, and I tried to put it behind me from the beginning, but now I can't live with this secret anymore. I felt the pain reappear, familiar and bitter, and although I wanted to forgive her, I couldn't hide the feeling of betrayal. This friend was important to me, and my love, which I thought was so pure, had failed me again. I couldn't understand why she couldn't have been open with me from the beginning. I lost my cool, and we were silent for a long time, each of us experiencing what had happened. Finally, I looked her in the eye and said, "We have to talk about this, and I don't know what to do next." And although I tried to be strong and composed, a real fire was burning inside me. Would I be able to trust her again? Should we continue this journey together? The situation was complicated, and the solution was not as obvious as I had initially thought. Sorry about the name discrepancy. Let me fix it and rework the story, replacing Sophia with Lisa, as you pointed out. Here's the sequel. Over time, the pain of betrayal became less noticeable. I was letting go of her, letting go of a whole part of my life that no longer had a place in my heart. It was hard at first. The emptiness in my soul seemed deep and unfilled, but I knew it was only temporary. I started to find strength in myself. I started meeting new people, getting to know new stories, new opportunities. However, interestingly, all this led me to one person. I met her by chance. It was Kate. She was completely different from Lisa. Her smile was bright, her voice warm and kind. She had no shadow of the past, no difficult moments that I could not digest. She was a new page in my life. We started to communicate, and every day I felt that there was a place in my heart for someone else. At first, I felt anxious because I thought it might be another reflection of the pain I had been through. But Kate was different. She didn't carry the shadow of betrayal. She didn't bring me to my knees. She didn't ask for forgiveness for what she hadn't done. With Kate, I realized one important thing. True love is not just moments of happiness. It is the ability to overcome difficulties together. And even when there was emptiness in my life, I felt that it could be the beginning of something new. She helped me to see that betrayal does not have to determine my future. Once, during one of our evenings together, I shared my story with her. I told her everything, from the first moment I met Lisa to the moment I decided to let her go. Kate listened, and there was no judgment or pity. She just understood. After that, we became even closer. My relationship with Kate helped me to realize that I was not the same person I used to be. I was not a victim of betrayal, not someone who was left alone with pain. I was someone who chose to move forward, and now I was ready to give a chance to a new happiness. This new path was not without pain, but it was real and honest. And although I sometimes thought about Lisa, I knew it was important, and it made me who I am today. Over time, I realized that this pain, which once seemed insurmountable, was part of my growth. I accepted it and continued to move forward. My story with Lisa was a part of my life, but with each new step I realized more and more that my future is not something that is left behind. It was something I would create myself. And with Kate, I felt that I had found this path again, not perfect, but sincere. My new life was not perfect, but it was mine. And now I realized that the ability to forgive myself and others is not only the path to peace, but also to a new beginning. For several months I felt my life changing, not only because I was with Kate, but also because I had found a part of myself that I had long forgotten. My identity was no longer burdened by the weight of betrayal and pain. I felt stronger, more confident. With each new day, I saw that my ability to love, trust, and move forward became much deeper. Kate was like a glimmer of light in the darkness for me. She didn't ask questions about the past, didn't judge me for the mistakes I made, and didn't compare me to others. She accepted me as I was, with all my fears, doubts, and pain. She allowed me to recover, and that was extremely important to me. But, despite all this, the feeling of uncertainty and fear of possible betrayal did not go away. I continued to be afraid that Kate, like Lisa, would sooner or later forget about me. I couldn't forget how I felt when my feelings were betrayed, when my trust was destroyed in a single moment. It was like a shadow following me even when I tried to move forward. Kate and I started talking about the future. She wanted to spend more time together, to build something serious and stable. I sometimes doubted it. Am I ready to trust again? And sometimes I was just scared at the thought of it. If only I could forget the moment when Lisa killed my heart with her words, when she betrayed me and left me in the dark. But with Kate it was different. She was not Lisa. She didn't pretend that things would be different, didn't promise heaven, and didn't say ridiculous things to reassure me. She was real with every word she said, with every step we took together. Nevertheless, I couldn't just forget what happened. It was impossible. So I decided that we needed to talk. Talk about everything that happened and what could happen. It was the only way I could find peace, realizing that no one would play with my feelings again. I asked Kate if we could talk, and we spent the evening in a coffee shop, which became a kind of place for us to reflect. We sat across from each other, choosing our words carefully, weighing each one. I wasn't ready for a big change, but I wanted to understand where I stood and what she really wanted from our relationship. "Aren't you afraid that I might cheat again?" I said. It was a casual question, but a difficult one. She was silent for a few minutes, looking at me carefully. I could see real concern in her eyes, but also a certain nervousness. "I cannot say that nothing will hurt or be easy, but I have not betrayed you and I am not going to do so. We can be honest with each other. And if you have doubts, I am ready to listen, and we will move slowly so that you can trust." These words really gave me comfort. She was ready not only to be with me, but also to be honest, to open her soul to me as much as I was ready to open mine. And I realized that it was important for both of us. We decided to move forward, not asking each other about the mistakes of the past, not carrying the burden of betrayal, but creating our own now. We were not perfect, but we were real. And perhaps that was the most important thing. Over time, I became more and more convinced that not all betrayals lead to the end. Sometimes, when you allow yourself to let go and give a new chance, you open up new opportunities, new horizons. And I was ready to allow myself to move forward, despite all the shadows of the past. Kate and I have traveled this path together. Was it without pain? No. But was it real and important to both of us? Yes. And it was a new beginning for us. We took our time. We built our relationship gradually, step by step. Every day was like a new page on which we wrote our story. And although I couldn't completely forget the past, every month I became more confident that we could create something real, pure, without the shadow of the pain that used to rule us. Kate understood me more and more, my fears, my doubts. She didn't demand anything that I didn't understand or didn't like. She was just there for me, supporting me when I needed it, and giving me the space to realize that I was ready to give more. Those moments of silence, when we sat together, silently watching the world, became the most valuable for me. They gave me the feeling that I was not alone, that even in this world where there is so much betrayal, there is a place for true connection. We planned the future, joint travels, dreams of new opportunities, career achievements, but most importantly, we worked to ensure that our relationship remained strong, without stress and fear that the old could return again. But a new challenge appeared on the horizon, and unfortunately I could not avoid it. One day, when Kate and I were returning from a weekend away, we stopped at a cafe to have a cup of coffee. At that moment, I noticed a car in the parking lot that I hadn't seen in my life recently. It belonged to Lisa. How did I recognize it? Lisa had been out of town for a few months. She had gone to see her new boyfriend, and we hadn't had any contact since then. I couldn't help but pay attention. The feeling of pain was breaking through again after a while. It was like a cherry berry that I first saw on a tree. It looked unforgettable, but very dangerous. I was overwhelmed by a flash of emotions and felt afraid of what might happen. What if it all happened again? What if I fall into the trap again? Kate noticed my reaction when I stopped at the entrance. She came up to me and gently touched my arm. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm down, but my heart was beating so fast I couldn't stop it. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice sounding soft, but with a hint of anxiety. I pulled out my phone and took a deep breath. It's Lisa," I said quietly. Kate didn't answer, but I could see her look change slightly. It wasn't fear or resentment, but rather the realization that perhaps the past hadn't left me completely. We went back to the car. Kate said quietly, "Don't you want to talk to her?" I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to do it, to find out why she had reappeared in my life. But another part of me said that it would only open the door to the past, and I wasn't ready for that. No, I don't want to," I said firmly. "I've been through enough." Kate smiled at me, and we drove back toward our house, laughing quietly about little things, forgetting about that moment. The moment when Lisa, despite all her betrayals, could still come back into my life. But I realized one thing: I no longer want to let the past dictate my future. My relationship with Kate was much more important, and I would not let anything that happened in the past ruin everything we had achieved together. The past left its scars, but we moved forward. and although there were moments of doubt, I felt that I was on the right track. Now, when I looked at Kate, I saw the future I had promised myself, and it was worth all the hard work. I was no longer afraid of betrayal. I was only afraid of one thing: losing what really mattered. Months passed, and life regained its usual rhythms. I began to feel more at ease. Although I no longer allowed the past to plunge me into despair, the feeling of deception and betrayal remained in my heart. It was like a shadow that sometimes appeared and reminded me of itself at the most inopportune moments. But now I didn't live in that shadow. I didn't let it drag me into its darkness. Kate became my support, and every day we built a stronger bond. She didn't ask about the past, but sometimes when she looked at me, I could see her eyes were filled with compassion and understanding. She could sense that I hadn't quite come to terms with what had happened yet, but she was there for me, and that gave me more strength than I could have ever imagined. But despite the fact that I was holding on, everything changed in one moment when I received a message. At first, I didn't pay attention to it. The message came from an unknown number, and even though I was so sure I didn't want to deal with that world anymore, I couldn't help myself. It was a short message. "We want to talk about Lisa. It's important." It was either curiosity or an inexplicable feeling that something big was coming my way that made me open it. I couldn't understand why it all happened now, after everything I had been through. How had it become possible? I answered, "What do you want from me?" A few minutes passed and I received a new message, and it was a shock for me. "Lisa is no longer with us. It happened because of what she did. It has to do with you." I felt my heart clench and my mind start to rage. What are they trying to say? What does this have to do with me? What happened to Lisa? My hands began to tremble. Couldn't believe it. Not in the same way as before, but a part of me was still wounded, connected to that name. I looked at the message on the screen and thought it could be another hoax. But I was so interested that I couldn't let it go. A few hours later, I received another message with coordinates. It was a place I recognized. Lisa had been found, and although I was afraid, I decided to go. Kate and I were at home when I told her everything. Her reaction was calm, but I could see her face turn serious. She realized that this wasn't just some kind of trouble. It was an opportunity for me to face once again what I feared most. I was ready to face the past, even though I didn't know what would come of it. Kate did not interfere. She knew it was my decision and supported me, even if it was hard. We traveled together to this place. Where we were staying was quiet. It was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was sad, but I felt that something was wrong. Everything was too quiet. I was ready for something shocking, but what I saw exceeded all my expectations. There, among the old boxes, was Lisa. She was dead. But it wasn't just that I saw her body. She was holding a phone, and the screen showed a part of our past. Another shocking moment emerged from the confession of the person who did it. We returned home, and I could not find words. In all of this, there was no answer to why all of this had happened. I couldn't even tell if Lisa was part of the world I had let go of or if she was just another stage in my story. But at that moment, I realized that life is not only about relationships, not only about betrayals and pain. It is still a bigger cycle in which we must move on, even if it seems overwhelming. I could no longer control everything around me, but I learned that there are things that cannot be changed. We all have our own paths, and they don't always lead to where we want to be. But I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer afraid to move on, and that was the most important thing. However, despite the fact that I began to realize that there must be a sequel, my heart was still not ready to say goodbye to the past. Lisa was an important part of my life, and her death left a void that I could not fill. No matter how hard I tried to move on, thoughts of her never left me. Kate felt it. She was there for me even when I went back to my routine, as if nothing had happened. She was ready to support me, but her eyes sometimes became foggy. I realized that my feelings about Lisa were keeping me from being truly happy with Kate. I couldn't explain it, but this internal struggle continued, and it kept me up at night. One evening, when I was trying to sort out my thoughts, I received another message. A name appeared on the screen that I didn't want to see again. It was Sarah. That night I saw her on my contact list, and although I had no intention of getting involved in her game again, for some reason I couldn't help myself. I decided to see what she wanted. "We have to talk," the message read. I was surprised by this. It was so unexpected that I couldn't help but think. Kate was already asleep, and I decided it was best to be honest with myself. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe I had to finally put an end to it all. I answered briefly, "What do you want to talk about?" Sarah didn't hesitate to answer. "You need to know the truth about Lisa, and who is really behind her death." My hand trembled as I pressed the button to view the next message. It was like a sentence. "You were part of this. We were all part of this." Sarah didn't explain what it meant, but I felt my whole world start to sway again. If what she was writing was true, I was involved in a situation far worse than I could have imagined. That evening I decided to meet her. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out what really happened. Kate fell asleep and I left the house, leaving her only a short note. The place where we met was a shady bar on the outskirts of the city. All these years I had avoided such places, but this time I had no choice. As soon as I walked in, Sarah was already sitting at a table in the corner. She looked just as I remembered her. Her features cold and indifferent, her eyes expressing nothing but calculation. She was not surprised when I sat down next to her. She knew why I had come. "I know why you're here," she said ruthlessly. "You want to understand why Lisa died, but to understand that, you need to understand how far this has gone." She sensed that I was still not ready for the truth, but her words sounded like a sentence. My fingers held the glass tightly, trying not to show how nervous I was. "This is not just an accident," Sarah continued. "Lisa was not just a victim. She was part of a bigger game that started much earlier than you could have ever imagined. And you were part of that game." I felt as if I was enveloped in a fog. The words she was saying were turning my perception of reality upside down. "How?" I could barely say it. "Lisa and I were on the same team," she said. "And Lisa knew more than you think. She knew who was really driving all these events. And what happened to her is part of what we all did." I couldn't take it anymore. It was too much, too many betrayals, too many intrigues. And the worst part was that I didn't even realize how I had become part of this dark game. "Who's behind this?" I finally said, feeling my heart start to beat faster. Sarah didn't answer right away. She took her bag and put it on the table and then pulled out a small box. She opened it and showed me a photo. It was a picture of the two of us. Only in this photo I was not who I thought I was. "You don't know who you really were," she said. "But you will." And the moment I realized that the world I was living in was just one big illusion, everything around me began to fall apart. And from that moment on, I realized that there was no going back. The ending was unexpected because none of the reasons I saw were the main ones. Sarah closed the box and her eyes grew cold, not even flinching as she added, "You were a part of it, but you can't change anything now. You're just one of the people who is slowly realizing how deeply involved in this game they are." Her voice became quiet but very clear, something I couldn't help but hear. I sat there, unable to say a word. My brain was working at its limit, trying to organize everything I had learned in the last few hours. I didn't know if I would be able to return to my normal life after this. Everything seemed so unreal. Is this all just a coincidence? I shouted, trying to find some way to connect everything that had happened into one logical line. I couldn't believe that I had been living in the dark all this time, and Sarah was part of what was about to happen. She remained silent, but I noticed a shadow of sadness in her eyes, as if she didn't want to do this either, but couldn't stop it. "You trapped yourself in this trap, Michael," she said calmly, "and now you have to decide for yourself what to do about it. The choice is yours alone." I took a deep breath, trying to collect my thoughts. My mind was a mess, but suddenly I realized that this was not just a coincidence, and that the choice was really mine alone. To really get rid of this invisible trap, I had to find a way to get out of the game that I couldn't give up before. But as it turned out, everything I did was just part of a plan I didn't understand. And at the moment when I was almost ready to say that I was done, I heard a sound. The sound of my phone. I checked my screen and there was only one name on it, Lisa. Couldn't be Lisa. She's dead. I saw her death with my own eyes. But when I picked up the phone, her voice was completely different, very cold. "You probably think it's over, right?" Lisa said over the phone, and I felt my heart freeze in place. "No, it can't be," I said barely audibly. "Yes, you got it right. You were part of all this even if you didn't know it. And now your choice is to stay in this darkness or try to get out. But it will be a completely different path." And at that moment I realized that this path, this new stage of my life, was not what I wanted. This story continued even further. I was in the center of something more than just a personal drama or betrayal. And even if I tried to avoid it, I was already involved in a game that I couldn't handle. Sarah was sitting next to me, but her eyes were staring off into the distance. She hadn't seemed the same to me for a long time. Her words, her behavior, everything was foreign. And when I started listening to Lisa on the phone, I felt like my whole world was falling apart. If only I knew where this was leading me. But even now, hearing her voice, I couldn't cope with what was going on in my head. "Do you want to know the truth?" Lisa asked, and her voice sounded like she was out of this world. She couldn't be alive, she couldn't be. That night when we met in that institution, I saw her death with my own eyes. Her blood, her body, her indifference to what had happened. But that voice, it was alive, real. It can't be you, I whispered, trying to collect myself. Lisa laughed, but her laugh sounded ominous. We all flirt with things that cannot be changed. You know this yourself. And Sarah, by the way, was also part of this game. She wasn't just watching Mikhail. She knew everything. You have no idea what was really going on. I could feel Lisa's every word penetrating my mind like poison. I couldn't believe that she was in all of this. Sarah, who was next to me, was just as much a part of it. She was betraying me not only physically, but emotionally as well, tangling me in a bigger and bigger tangle of deception. This is not your life, Mikhail. You were just a puppet we controlled. Lisa said again, her voice calm, almost emotionless. And Sarah, she's not yours. She was part of our plan, just like you. I didn't know how to react. I could no longer trust anyone, not even myself. Everything I thought was already twisted. Sarah was not there, but I could feel her presence in every word, every gust of wind that filled the room. She was a part of it. And the more I thought about it, the harder it became to accept what was happening. You don't understand, Mikhail. You will never understand until you dive deeper. Your whole life has been a lie, and now you're alone in it, Lisa said, her voice sharp, like a knife blade. What do you want from me? I could barely manage this question, even though it no longer mattered. The answer was obvious. They were still in the game, and I was part of this theater. Do you want the truth? Do you want to understand why this happened? Lisa continued, her voice growing colder, even more ominous. But you made your own choice, just like we did. Don't forget, Mikhail, this world, this nightmare, you chose it. And now it's too late to change anything. I closed my eyes, trying to dismiss these words, but they still kept coming back to me. I had no chance to escape from this circle. Everything I had done, everything I had experienced, was part of something much bigger than I could have ever imagined. You know, Mikhail, I've always wanted you to see all this. And now you do, Lisa said, her voice less ominous but no less frightening. I did not answer. My soul was empty, and my mind was filled with nothing but empty thoughts. What I had learned was horrifying, and now I was trapped in this game forever. All my attempts to escape, everything I tried to achieve, made no sense. We were all part of something that could not be stopped. And I was just one more piece in this puzzle that never seemed to fit together. Do you want to know more? Asked Lisa, her tone soft, but again with a deadly threat. No, I answered, but I felt that it didn't matter anymore. I sat there, clutching the phone in my hands, and felt my heart beating faster and faster. Lisa, or what was left of her voice, was now getting closer, her words sounding more and more clear. I was trapped in my own trap, and I had the feeling that every step I took was bringing me closer to something catastrophic. You thought it was over, didn't you? Lisa continued, her voice calm, as if I was still the same guy she once loved. But now that, we can do things differently. We can finish the game. A game, I said, as if I couldn't believe my words. My entire consciousness was upside down, and even now, facing reality, I could not find a solid basis for my thoughts. Everything that was happening seemed wrong, somehow unbearably distorted. Yes, Lisa laughed softly. It was all a game, Mikhail. You were just a piece on our board. And if you want to understand why we did it, you can go to the place where it all started. Are you talking about Sarah? I asked, even though I already realized that this question would not change anything. I probably wouldn't get the answer I was looking for. She was part of this game, part of a plan in which I had no part. Sarah. Lisa paused. She wasn't your friend. She was part of something bigger. And you know what that something is. You can take the last step, and this will be your chance to understand. Now I felt completely helpless. All the memories of our past with Sarah, all the moments when I trusted her, seemed empty. I couldn't understand how I ended up here, how I became a part of this game that looked ridiculous and terrifying at the same time. Do you really want me to go to this place? I asked, already knowing the answer. It was a trap and I was in it, but I couldn't refuse. My thirst for the truth was too strong. Go, Lisa said. You have to find this place. Only then will you understand. I slowly put the phone down, unable to bear that voice any longer, that heavy feeling it brought me. Everything I had known and understood had turned into a blur that I could not untangle. And although I wasn't sure what exactly I was supposed to do, I pulled myself free of that connection and set off. Not knowing if it was the right idea, I went to the place where it all started, hoping to find some kind of answer, even though it seemed to make no sense anymore. My heart was beating faster. My legs were walking involuntarily. This was the path to the end. Was it the end? I didn't know, but I could not turn back. I walked down the street, but every step seemed heavy to me, as if I were dragging a heavy burden that I couldn't lift. All the time I had spent thinking about the betrayal, about Lisa, about Sarah, seemed to me to be in vain. I couldn't shake the feeling that my actions were just part of a larger mechanism in which I had long since played no part. No one was waiting for me, neither Lisa nor Sarah. I was just walking, and although my mind was swarming with thoughts, I couldn't find an answer to any of the questions that bothered me. What was waiting for me when I got to that place? Is there any hope of justification or understanding of what happened? My heart beat even faster as I approached the very place. The old coffee shop where it all began. I remembered this place from the very beginning, when Sarah first told me about her new projects, when we laughed together at silly jokes. It was such an intimate place for us. And even now I could feel the peace despite everything that was happening. The entrance was open. I stepped through the door, and the smell of coffee immediately hit my nose. The inside world seemed so familiar, almost the same as it had been before. But it was here, among all these familiar faces, that I felt a kind of terrible silence filling the space. It was everywhere, in the air, in every look. And then I realized I was not alone. Lisa was sitting in the corner. She was sitting the way she always did, with the same expression on her face that I remembered. Serene, calm, as if nothing had happened. But what I saw next to her came as a shock to me. He was a man. He was tall, with black hair, and his eyes had the same lack of emotion that I had seen in Lisa. He was not familiar. He was not someone I could recognize. "You came," Lisa said, looking up at me. There was no despair in her voice, no excitement, only cold calmness. She was ready. "What is it?" I could not control my voice. All my words sounded stupid, like a child's question. But everything inside me was literally exploding with emotion. She just sat there silently, and that man was looking at me as if he knew I was there. "That's him," Lisa replied, pointing to her husband. "My husband." My heart froze. "What?" I turned to her. Was this man her husband? "You don't understand anything, do you?" she said with a slight smile. "You were part of a big game, Mikhail. And now that you've realized that, you can leave it all behind. Because that's your only decision. Either you become a part of this world or you leave. And with every step you take, you will be further away from understanding." I stood there, unable to understand what was happening. My whole consciousness was filled with chaos. But deep down I realized that I had taken the last step, and now there was no turning back. Lisa and her husband left me, staring at me in silence. I didn't know what to do. All the illusions I had been holding on to had fallen apart. There was only one thing left for me to do, to realize that I was no more than a part of their plan, and even my pain no longer mattered. I stood in front of them as if immersed in a darkness that made it impossible for me to find my way back. Lisa, her husband, all of it, it was all part of something I couldn't understand. I thought I knew what I wanted, that this story would end when I found out the truth. But there was no truth. The truth was far from what I had imagined. Lisa slowly got up from her seat and came to me. Her eyes were cold, but there was no anger in them. Only calmness, like a person who has long accepted her fate. She stopped next to me, looking me straight in the eye, and I felt something inside me start to collapse. "Mikhail, you still don't understand?" Her voice was soft but hard, like a hammer hitting stone. I didn't answer. All I wanted was for it to be over so I could go back to the life I once had. But that was no longer possible. She continued, as if not noticing my silence. "You were a test for me. I was sure that you would not survive, that you would remain blind and never know the truth. And you really were blind." She paused, her gaze turning cold. "But you learned more than I could have ever imagined. And now that everything is clear, I can finally close this chapter." Stage. I finally found the strength to say something. My voice sounded like a broken mechanism. "Yes, a stage," she repeated, backing away a few steps. "It wasn't just a betrayal, Mikhail. It was something more. I stopped loving you a long time ago, and when you started to learn more about us, everything became clear. I didn't say anything. My thoughts were racing, but I couldn't find the right words. Then Lisa's husband, the one who was sitting next to me, also came over to me. His gaze was calm, even a little dismissive. I noticed something strange in his eyes, as if he didn't care what I was feeling. But he had no intention of stopping. "You don't understand, Mikhail." His voice was low and clear. "You were part of the plan. And even what you know now doesn't change anything. Lisa and I decided a long time ago that you are no longer important to us." I felt the ground under my feet start to shake. It became difficult to breathe, and I realized that I didn't know what to do next. My reality was falling apart like a house of cards, and everything I was holding on to seemed like an illusion. They left me standing on the threshold of this place. I did not know what to do. My hands were empty. My heart was empty. All my efforts, all my aspirations to bring everything back, none of it mattered. I stood there with no plan, no hope, and perhaps that was the end. The moment when everything became clear and there was no more room for any doubts. I remained standing in the shadows, like a cold stone in a space that no longer belonged to me. Thoughts were spinning in my head, but they no longer made sense. My reality was crumbling, and I couldn't find my way back. Lisa, her husband, all of it. They were manipulating me, playing by their own rules, and I was just a pawn on their chessboard. Their calm look was the last straw. Everything I had once imagined about our family, about our love, melted away like snow in the first sun. I could not understand how it happened. How could I, being so naive, not see it all before? Lisa was still standing there, looking at me with the same cold expression. There was no pity or shame in her eyes, only indifference. She took the ring off her finger and put it on the table in front of me. "Did you really think that all this could be reversed?" Her voice was soft, but it echoed in my ears like a blow. "I made up my mind a long time ago. I'm sorry, but I'm not the person you thought I was. And you are not the man I once loved." I looked at the ring. The same ring I had chosen for her a few years ago. The very ring that was supposed to symbolize my loyalty and love for her. And now it had become an empty sign that reminded me of my hopelessness. "Don't waste any more time," her husband said, his voice less gentle. "You see how things have turned out. You don't mean anything to us anymore." I was silent. What else could I say? My heart was already broken, and I had no strength to fight. I was just going to leave. I realized that I could not change what had happened. It was final. My life was no longer what I had imagined it to be. I walked down the street, feeling like every step was taking me further away from what had once been my world. But the further I walked, the more I realized that it was just a new beginning. Yes, it hurts, it's unfair, but I couldn't stay in the trap they had created for me any longer. I stopped on the street corner, looking at the passers-by who were going about their lives without knowing my story. And suddenly I realized that their paths were not like mine. I was free. And even if it was on the worst possible terms, I was back on the path to myself. I returned home, but without the memories that tied me to Lisa. I was ready to move on, even though it was hard. Although my soul was broken, I realized that life goes on. Betrayal cannot be forgotten, but it can be forgiven, not to her, but to yourself. And maybe that was the only real victory I could have. Now I knew that true strength is not in staying where you are betrayed, but in finding the strength to get up and move on, even if it seems impossible. Each step was hard, but I took it, and although I didn't know where it would lead, I knew it wouldn't be the same as the path that led me to Lisa. I kept walking. Each step seemed to take away some of my pain, but it was replaced by a coldness that I began to feel inside. The city around me was the same, ruthless, noisy, but I no longer saw anything familiar in it. All these people, their conversations, laughter, so many invisible connections between them, and I was alone. And I wasn't sure if I could find a place for myself in this world. I usually walked as if I were looking for answers. Sometimes I stopped and looked at familiar places that used to be part of my life. It was a meaningless process, because all these places no longer had the warmth I used to feel. Everything became somehow alien. Even my memories began to fade, as if clouded by a haze. I found myself on an old bridge. In the distance, I could see the silhouettes of the buildings that I once considered my home, my fortress. And here I stood on the very edge and realized that I no longer belonged here. The city was no longer mine, and I was no longer a part of its pulsating life. At that moment, I felt broken, as if taken out of context, and at the same time, to some extent, free again. I realized that I was no longer waiting to return, and it was not easy. How could I let go of everything? How could I forget Liza, her face, her smile? How could I survive this step when there was an emptiness in my soul? We all live in relationships in which there is a certain balance, and I never noticed this until I realized that the balance was lost. Loss doesn't just take away, it changes us. Now I was a person who once had love, and now it was just a memory of what I once lived. And so I walked, slowly, measuredly, to what really mattered. It was not an escape. It was just a movement, step by step, even when it was hard, even when it seemed to make no sense. I didn't know how long it would last, but I knew I was heading for something new, something I couldn't yet see, but that would change me. And even though it would be difficult, I was ready to move on. Now I was free, though wounded, but free. Life really did go on, even if I couldn't understand it completely. Now I knew one thing: betrayal can be survived, but it is up to you to decide when to let it go. And although it was hard, I let go. I don't know how much time has passed, but with every step, with every breath, I felt this pain gradually weakening. This did not mean that I had forgotten. No, it meant that I had learned to live with it, and maybe that was even harder than letting go. But I was beginning to realize that pain is not something that destroys. It is something that makes you change. I was a different person now, and although I still had a lot of questions, I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I often thought about Liza, about everything we had been through, about how her every look and word used to mean everything to me. And now, when we were strangers to each other, I was beginning to realize that maybe she was looking for her own way too. And it was not my fault. She and I just couldn't stay on the same road. The city I once considered home became something alien to me, just like the people around me. With every step I took, I realized that I no longer belonged to anything. But at the same time, a new strength, a new sense of freedom was born in me. And even though it was scary, I felt that this was my chance. Maybe I didn't know where I was going yet, but I was sure that I had the right to choose for myself. One day I stopped on the bank of a river, looking at the reflections of light on the surface of the water. It was a moment of silence, of peace, which I missed so much, and I realized that this period in my life was not the end. It was a new beginning. I was not the person I used to be. I was no longer the man who was betrayed. I was the one who survived it and kept moving. I left the city behind. Although it was not easy, I felt it was the right thing to do. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't looking for retribution. I was just moving forward, step by step, learning to live in a new way. Now, when I look back, I realize that my strength is not in forgetting, but in not letting the pain control me. Life does not always go according to plan, and not everything can be predicted. But I have learned to appreciate every moment. I am no longer afraid of change. And although it is still difficult, I realize that this is my new reality. We may not be able to return to what we once were, but I know that I will find myself again, and this time I will be stronger than ever. And so, I stood on the threshold of a new life, where there was no more room for regrets, resentments, or questions that had once tormented me. All that remained was to accept this moment, realize that the past could not be returned, and move on. I could no longer afford to be the man who was betrayed, because now I was the one who was able to overcome it. Lisa, Sophia, these names, these moments, all of them became part of my story, but no more. They no longer had power over me. I was no longer looking for answers, because I realized that life is not about finding them. It's about living with what you have. I didn't know what was ahead of me, but I was ready. And this time I went forward not with a sense of loss, but with a sense of liberation. My life went on, and although it was changed, it was my own. And that was its power.